Joining me today is Dr. Marty Makary. On November 22nd, 2024, Marty was nominated by President-elect Donald Trump to be America's new FDA Commissioner. In this interview today, he and I discussed several health challenges, including pesticide use.
We are watching the age of puberty go down every year by a week and a half. Why?
Overprescription of antibiotics.
The next pandemic, which is drug-resistant superbugs. It's already here.
Childbirth practices.
The pendulum swung to the overmedicalization of childbirth.
And many other medical blind spots. This is information that every American citizen needs to know. And I'm beyond excited that Marty will soon be fighting the good fight within the complex bureaucratic system of the FDA. The health landscape is changing, and people like Marty are on the cutting edge. So with that, enjoy today's interview with Dr. Marty Makary. Marty, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Steph.
I'm so excited. So for anyone who missed our conversation last time, you joined me about 2 months ago, right, to discuss your book?
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, it was so fun. Toward the end of the interview, you mentioned the impact of pesticides on the body. We were talking a little bit about the gut. And then last night at dinner, we started diving deeper. And I was like, oh, you have to come back. We need to go even deeper into all these topics.
It's amazing. Gut health is really central to overall health. And we never talk about it. Never once in medical school did we talk about how the microbiome is training the immune system, how it's involved in absorption, how it's producing serotonin and GLP-1, a little micro dose of Ozempic, naturally made by your gut. It's connected to so many areas of health. We never talk about it. And not only do we never talk about it, we never talk about the things that are altering the microbiome. Think about all the things that are carpet bombing the microbiome. We talked about antibiotics last time, which save lives, but they're also changing the microbiome. Pesticides kill insects. What do we think they're doing to the microbiome? That is the bacteria that line the gut. And some of these pesticides not only alter the microbiome, they are directly toxic or change the hormone composition and physiology of our body. The most common pesticide in the United States is glyphosate. Mm-hmm. It's banned in most parts of the world, and glyphosate has been associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other different medical problems.
Yeah. And what foods is it on? Like everything, or I mean, I know it's on wine. That's the one thing I do know. But what else is it on?
It's amazing. Yeah, they can detect molecules of glyphosate in wine, in kernels of corn, in soybean, in so many different agricultural products. It's about 90% of our food supply is sprayed with pesticides, and glyphosate is the most common. Mm-hmm. Glyphosate has been recognized now, and you'll even see class action lawsuits for people who went by the cutesy term Roundup. Mm-hmm. So people who used Roundup as part of their job, there are now class action lawsuits.
Because they're now have cancer and things?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Because of cancer risk.
Yeah.
And the number 2 pesticide in the United States is atrazine. Now, atrazine is a known hormone disruptor. This is a chemical that in the laboratory, in a famous frog study, was found to actually change the gender of a frog, convert a male tadpole to a female frog later in life, to the point where the frog could actually lay eggs. Mm-hmm. That's how strong of a hormone disruptor it was. And it wasn't at mega doses. It was at 2 parts per billion or less. The EPA standard supposedly is 3 parts per million. Where did they get that from? They made it up. Mm-hmm. Probably the industry told them. And so not at mega doses, but at doses below the EPA standard, this pesticide converts male tadpoles to female tadpoles. They observed in this famous study homosexual behavior of frogs. Now, I'm not going to interpret that finding, but these were studies out of a famous scientist from UC Berkeley who was hired by the pesticide company, the company that makes atrazine, mm-hmm. to do some of these experiments. And when they saw the results, they basically tried to suppress him from making them public.
Wow.
And he decided to just go all out. I mean, this guy's fearless.
Is he alive still?
He's alive.
Ooh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
He went on Democracy Now! There's an amazing interview out there on the internet about his observations of what atrazine does as a hormone disruptor. It has other downsides to our health. It's in everything. Atrazine is in school lunches. It's showing up in the urine of children. It's in cord blood of newborn babies. And so is there anything we can do? Yes, there is something we can do. You can buy organic, especially when the surface of the fruit or vegetable is what you're consuming. You could have a higher load of those pesticides when you're eating the surface. You can wash fruits and vegetables, even organic sometimes will have some crossover contamination. It's good to wash your fruits and vegetables before eating them. But atrazine that's a bad actor in society. And the food industry will say, well, we have to mass produce food. If you go back into the 1950s, there's a great book called Tyranny of the Gene. I think one of the best books, second to Blind Spots, one of the best books that I've seen this year. Tyranny of the Gene goes through the 1950s. The pesticide industry was saying, hey, the planet is going to be overrun with insects. We have to use these pesticides. And they also argued that there would be mass starvation if they couldn't mass produce food with pesticides. You still see remnants of those arguments in public policy circles today. We may need to spend more for food that is healthier, but look at the cost of chronic diseases. We have a $4.5 trillion healthcare system. And what are we doing? We're watching all of these chronic conditions increase, including infertility, which has been associated with atrazine. Atrazine was found to lower sperm counts. And it's, by the way, not just frogs. They looked at it in birds and fish and other mammals. What's going on with human sperm counts today in the United States? Boys today in school in the United States, sperm counts are down 50% over the last 5 decades. Infertility rates are going up. Here's a known hormone disruptor. We are watching the age of puberty go down every year by a week and a half. One of those incredible moments I remember in medical school where we were told the age of puberty has been decreasing. It's now years earlier than it was just a century ago. And then they go on to the next, set of drugs you're supposed to memorize. And I remember my buddies and I were like, whoa, what? Say that again? The age of puberty is now like 3 years earlier than it was just half a century ago. Why? And as you know, one of the most dangerous things you can do right now in society is ask big questions.
Yep. Do we know now why? Like, what does that mean if it's actually coming down? Like, how do I think about that in the grand scheme of things?
So certain things have hormone binding properties, estrogen binding properties. Pesticides, microplastics, which are ubiquitous now since their sort of introduction in 1907. If all of these things are occurring in our current living generation, we are watching conditions go from being rare to common. We're watching puberty go down each year by a week and a half on average. We are still seeing girls in Europe undergo puberty at age 16.
Yeah.
Right? And here in the United States, you'll see it as early as age 10.
Yeah.
What is going on? No one's talking about the hormone-like binding properties of pesticides, microplastics, and other chemicals that are in the food supply. But those are the big ones. How is it that we are watching this existential threat, I'm going to use that term, to our species, and no one talks about it? In medical school, it was shocking how dismissive they were. And it's not because anyone was a bad person in medical school or the professors are evil. I don't believe that. I see the best in people. It's because it's not part of our culture to ask these big questions. It's part of our culture to be obedient in medicine and to do what you're told, memorize the drugs, learn the enzymes, come out, take your exams, focus on billing and coding, see patients in short visits, throw meds at them, refer them for surgery, and no one is saying, what are we doing?
Yep.
We're not talking about the biggest health issues of our day.
Yeah. I mean, other countries, though, have figured this out. Like, why wouldn't we just look at Europe when everyone talks about if we do that here, if we ban those pesticides, food prices will go up, all these things will happen. But I mean, there's other countries that we can look at as examples, right? That we could be like, look, they don't have these things in there. They still have food. People can somehow figure out how to afford it.
Yeah, Europe is not overrun with insects.
Yeah.
They're not in a food starvation mode. Europe has banned glyphosate, atrazine. They're vigilant with the chemicals that are allowed in their food supply. They have to prove that they're safe before they just let them be inserted into the food supply. Here we have the opposite standard. We have a standard which is basically innocent till proven guilty. Food companies can engineer whatever chemical they want, add it to the food supply. And as long as they generally believe it's safe, what we call GRAS, generally recognized as safe. That's basically the regulation that governs what goes in our school lunches and children's cereals. As long as they generally recognize it's safe, then they can do whatever they want. So if we just look at Europe and look at the United States, they have lower rates of obesity, diabetes, depression, infertility. What is going on? Nobody is willing to do these big analyses at the NIH or Pharma is not going to fund these types of big studies. These are the studies we need. And honestly, it's common sense. I mean, sometimes we cannot see the forest from the trees. Look at what we do in medicine. We pigeonhole ourselves and we say the only thing we're going to believe are randomized controlled trials where you isolate one exposure or an intervention and follow people for 5 or 10 years. Well, we're not going to get the double-blinded study on red dye number 40 or yellow dye number 5 over a 10-year period. And do you need it when these molecules are known to have detrimental effects, including in the microbiome of other mammals? Or can we have cereal in the United States that is like the cereal in Canada, where they do not allow yellow number 5 and red number 40? So at some point, we need to say our model of insisting on research that fits our methodological design should not be the 100% prerequisite to make informed decisions about food. Look at the Amish communities and the Amish communities are mixed. It's a mixed group. You have some that you're using pesticides and some that eat ultra-processed foods and junk food. And you have others that don't. Look at the subset that don't. They have lower rates of all these chronic conditions. So at some point, we just have to use common sense. People are asking me all the time, is AI going to change medicine? Is it going to revolutionize your job? We don't need AI. We just need I. We just need basic intelligence. We need common sense. We need to look at the macro. We need to zoom out and ask, what are we doing? We're going backwards with chronic diseases. What are we doing differently?
What do you think it takes to shift this? Because, you see what happens when consumers try to rise up, let's just say the thing against Kellogg's, and we'll get into, artificial dyes and all that. But people trying to, put this on the radar and say, hey, these foods are really bad. And like 90% of your cereals that are being consumed has this in it for our kids. And then I think Kellogg's just did something to make that woman go away. I don't know where she is right now, but...
Oh, Vani Hari, she's terrific.
Yeah, it was like a big thing, and now I haven't heard anything. So I'm like, what happened?
Yeah.
Like, what does it take to shift it? Is it consumers? Is it just free market? We're not buying these anymore. It feels like a lot to try and educate everyone on this. Is it actually a government thing? There's so much lobbying. Like, I just don't know how to get out of this in America.
I think it's what you just said, education. I think we've got to educate the public, and we've done it before. We've done it with cigarettes. We've done it with added sugar. We can do it now with chemicals in the food supply. We can educate people that yellow dye number 5 is not a cutesy term for a benign ingredient that is naturally occurring. It is tartrazine. Tartrazine is made from coal tar. It is synthetic in a laboratory. They found that it's a bright yellow, vibrant color. So they started just putting it in fabrics to make a bright yellow fabric. And then someone decided, hey, let's just put it in cereal. Now, Kellogg will tell you, kids prefer the more brightly colored Fruit Loops with the chemicals in the United States.
That's what marketing does. You make them prefer it.
That's what marketing does. And you know what? They may prefer cocaine. Does that, there's, anyway.
Give them what they want.
There's we talk about medical dogma, and we have in this book Blind Spots. One of the dogmas is that all things are good and safe in moderation. Where does that come from? Is that true of cocaine? Is it true of...
Probably the alcohol industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right? These are assumptions that we need to challenge. I would argue that you can raise children without screen time addiction and without chemicals in their food supply, at least until they're beyond the formative years.
Yeah.
And you don't have to give them a cell phone before they turn 13 or 15. I mean, we have these assumptions. I have parents who tell me, well, I had to give him a cell phone because he's 11 and all his friends have one.
Too bad.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Maybe. Yeah. So my sister raised her kids through the formative years with 0 screen time, not even looking at pictures on a phone. 0. When I think it was when they turned 6 or 7, she had a family movie night, because you don't want your kids to feel like they're left out of society.
Yep.
Family movie night with the most boring Mr. Rogers. I think it was actually a Mr. Rogers, the film on Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the scenes are moving slowly. Somebody's talking.
Yep.
It's not like, these NFL ad, commercials that come just constantly just flipping, hitting those dopamine surges in the brain. And she ensured there was no added sugar in their diets, and she bought organic whenever possible. So they grew up without chocolate, ice cream, candy, hard candy, and she found alternatives that they loved. So she created a culture around the boy, her son, my nephew, loved frozen peas when he was like 2 years old.
Oh, go
loved
him.
them. So she would say like, hey, we're going to have a treat. We're going to have a snack. And you get your frozen peas. And so it created this reward mechanism. He had a bunch of foods like that he loved that were healthy. And so he went to school for the birthday parties and the, whatever other holidays they have now. And he went in with his healthy snacks.
Yep.
You can do it. It is doable. It's work. People don't want to raise their kids nowadays. But if you work at it, you could see these tremendous benefits like my sister has seen, where her children can actually shake your hand, look at you in the eyes, have a conversation with you, have some intellectual curiosity. They're not impulsive or jittery. They're not racing to get back to their phones. I think we need more human connection in today's world.
Hey, I'm doing that with 4 kids. So if I can do it with 4, anyone can do it. But yeah, no screen times, no added sugar. And there was a point where they were watching some screens, and then I just took it away. And it was 2 weeks of very annoying behaviors. And then after that, great. They were shifting into creating plays for each other and building fake businesses, and very, very creative. And so, I mean, it can be a hard transition if you're used to that, but I'd say, 2 weeks and then they're used to it.
The worst behavior you will see in children is if you give them screen time and then take it away, give them added sugar and take it away.
Yep.
And so you don't have to give it to them.
Yeah.
It's like,
it's easier not to.
It's just work. It's work, right?
So now that we're getting into mom questions.
Yeah.
I love this. I'm like, this is just time for me now to ask questions. We briefly touched on childbirth last time, but we really didn't have enough time to get into it. And I know you have some interesting, just studies that you've seen and research around this, around what the old world, was like when it comes to childbirth, and maybe what some people still don't know. Like, what's the research showing when it comes to this space?
So there are some amazing best practices when it comes to childbirth that are now studied and established in the field. And they're still not widely adopted. It's still kind of haphazard whether or not you get offered these best practices. But I go through them in the book Blind Spots. And a couple of them are really ancient techniques of childbirth. This is a very old procedure. I mean, cavemen delivered babies. They didn't do a good job because they didn't know best practice. It was dirty, and lots of women died of infections. And so there was a very high maternal and child mortality up until the modern era of antibiotics and the medicalization of childbirth. But the pendulum swung to the over-medicalization of childbirth. And now the medical field is sort of recognizing that we were overdoing it. For example, when a baby is born, why do we cut the umbilical cord immediately?
Yeah. That's how you're trained.
That's how I was trained. I was like, get it. Here it is. Cut it.
Yeah.
Second the baby comes out. There it is, Marty. Cut it. It was a med student.
Jeez.
It's like, what is this? Like fire drill every time, like it's an emergency. The umbilical cord, we now recognize, should continue to pulsate for a few minutes after birth. Almost as long as it is pulsating, let it pulsate. It is delivering stem cells and fetal hemoglobin, which has a very high oxygen binding. It's got nutrients. The fluid is warm, which warms the baby. It's a direct infusion of warm fluid into their circulatory system. Instead, we cut the umbilical cord, race off to some back table, and put the baby under some French fry light.
French fry light.
Something to rewarm. And I remember asking, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And they would say, oh, we have to rewarm the baby quickly. Well, the baby was just getting an infusion of warm blood and fluids.
Yep.
That we just suddenly cut off, So there are all these great ironies.
Yeah.
Now, for the most part, there is delayed cord clamping now worked into clinical practice. It's recent and it's variable, but you can now design your sort of delivery plan with your doctor. And one of those things is delayed cord clamping for a few minutes. Doesn't have to be for 10 minutes or 7 minutes. I mean, for a few minutes. Studies have shown that it reduces the need for a blood transfusion for the baby, reduces risks of going to the NICU. A baby has a more normal heart rate and vital signs. When a baby is held by the mother skin to skin, what we call kangaroo time. Did you do that with your kids?
Yep.
Good.
Right away. Yeah, that was because I had to request it, though. I don't think they would have done it.
Good for you.
Because it was twins. I think they were like, I was like, no, over here.
Yeah. Good for you. And that's why I wrote the book. I want people to know all these best practices I lay out. Skin to skin time results in a baby having more normal vital signs, including a more normal glucose level. Now, I get the more normal vital signs. I did not get why a baby held by the mother for a long time has a more normal glucose level until Dr. Sharuvlu, who I interviewed for the book, who's a real leader in this field. She explained it to me. The baby's hormones are not spiking. The stress hormones are not spiking as high. And so when we know is that when those steroids naturally in the body spike, it alters your glucose metabolism.
Yeah.
So a more normal glucose is a surrogate indicator that baby is less stressed.
Yep. Which to me, this makes just logical sense. I mean, even if you think about the act of co-regulating your kid just by holding them and making sure you're regulated to then regulate their nervous system. Like if you're doing that when they're 2, 3, 4, why wouldn't you do that right when they're born? When they're probably like, what the hell? Like, yes, bring it to you. Yes. Hold on to him, her, and like help regulate, and don't let, your baby go into all this stress by being put on a metal tray and weighed for whatever reason. And like right away, is that all necessary?
Yeah. Do we need to do it like 4 seconds? Like there's a lot of things we do in the first 60 seconds of life that we can do a little bit later. Yeah. Okay. Do we need to be giving babies a hepatitis B vaccine?
Oh, yeah, I said no to that as well. I also said no to putting the stuff in their eyes. I was like, why do you want to put stuff in their eyes? And they're like, oh, just in case you have STDs. I'm like, you already tested me.
Yeah.
You know I don't have them. Why would you do that? And they're like, just in case. I'm like, no.
It's very primitive.
Yeah.
It's very much, it has a paternalism to it. Well, people don't follow, they don't listen to us, and the tests could be wrong, so we have to do it anyway. It's very paternalistic.
Yeah.
Why do we wash babies?
Yeah.
The second they're born.
Yeah. Also, it was a no to that.
You don't need, the babies have this natural sort of coat when they're born, and it's good for thermal insulation. It's also good for the microbiome because the bacteria for the microbiome are seeded. They're seeding the baby's gut from the bacteria from the birth canal. And so when you wash a baby immediately upon birth, you're altering that seeding process. And that's why it's also important to avoid unnecessary C-sections. Now, C-sections save lives just like antibiotics do, but roughly 40% are unnecessary. What happens when you have a C-section is a baby, instead of having their microbiome formed or seeded from the bacteria in the birth canal, a sterile baby with a sterile gut is extracted from a sterile operative field in a C-section. And what may seed their gut microbiome are not the bacteria from the birth canal. It may be the bacteria that normally live in the hospital, which are very different bacteria, sometimes not good bacteria. And a recent study just found a higher rate of colon cancer in young people among young people born by C-section. It's study in JAMA Surgery. So JAMAs are the #1 most read journal in medicine. It's not a fringe journal. JAMA Surgery, the study just came out. We've known when you're born by C-section, you have a different microbiome, higher rates of allergy, asthma, You have higher rates of inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Also, breastfeeding is important. And when a baby's born by C-section, they're less likely to latch quickly and begin that first golden hour feeding. That's important for the microbiome. Some women cannot breastfeed, understandably. They physiologically cannot. If a woman can, it does change the microbiome. So there's a lot of things in childbirth that people need to know that I'm not sure everybody knows. And some good health professionals educate people on this, but it's good to be educated and to know and to ask questions. And that's why I wrote that book.
Yeah, no, this is great. I think there's also so many places in the world that you can find studies that are happening on their own. I think it's Brazil. Aren't the C-section rates there like 90% because of
private hospitals? Yeah,
90% of people are getting C-sections just because of, I guess, they think that it'll mess them up if they have it naturally. And I don't know what the stigma is around having natural babies there, but I'm like, that seems like a perfect container to go and look at how these kids are turning out afterwards.
Folklore is that they will not be able to have the same sexual activity with a dilated vagina from a natural childbirth. Now, I think it's done a tremendous amount of damage to children in Brazil. And because of a dogma that came from the medical profession that there's no difference between a C-section and a vaginal delivery, take your pick. You can do one or the other. What would you like to do?
Yeah.
And we still have heard of, in writing the book, I get a lot of feedback. And one of them is that a patient had said, a woman who was pregnant, who has been seeing a doctor, said on the first prenatal visit, when they check out and they are supposed to make their appointment for their next prenatal visit, the receptionist there asked, when would you like to schedule your C-section? It was never discussed with the doctor. And she, of course, said, well, I didn't know we were having a C-section. And isn't this something we need to talk about? And the receptionist says, well, it's just good for us to hold a date. You don't have to use it, but let's hold a date for your C-section.
It's insane.
What kind of informed consent is that?
Yeah. And most moms would probably be like, oh, if you think that's best, okay. And then, it sounds easier. I'll put it on a certain date that I want. If it's safer, I better do it that way.
Well, that term is what I call the nudge. And I wrote about this in the book, The Price We Pay. We have this powerful force to persuade in medicine, and I call it the nudge. If you misrepresent the options and tell a woman, for example, a woman in labor, anywhere in the world, you tell that woman, hey, I think we should do a C-section. It might be safer for the baby. 100. If you phrase it that way, 100% of women are going to say, well, then do it. And let's do it right away. Sometimes it's manipulation because sometimes it's not safer for the baby. Sometimes it is, of course. I want to make that clarification. But if you tell a person anywhere in the world, hey, your knee hurts because you got bone grinding on bone, the so-called bone on bone, they're going to be like, well, geez, then I guess I need it replaced. Even though the bone is normally on bone. It's just a matter of how much cartilaginous tissue there is, right? So we're known for these kind of nudges that sometimes, I've witnessed them in the hospital. Yep. Again, I don't want people to be cynical about their physicians, but people should know outside of an emergency, you should ask questions and be educated.
How do you become educated? I'm just thinking about, these two things when it comes to childbirth, when it comes to antibiotics, especially when it comes to antibiotics, how do you know if what your doctor's telling you is right? Because I think, we talked about this. There is a very large contrast between people who are like, I 100% trust my doctor. They've given me antibiotics 5 times this year and I needed it every time. And then you swing to the other side, let's just say people here in Austin who are like, no antibiotics ever. And there's just no trust for, traditional doctors. So how do you find that middle ground, and how do you even know what questions to ask to know, should I give my kids antibiotics right now? Or how do I explore alternatives, knowing that you're probably in a fear state and you're just like, I probably just need to do, maybe what I'm told, or you go the wrong way.
Beware of the phrase, the antibiotics probably won't help you, but they won't hurt you. That is medical dogma. It's not true. I make the case in the book. You really want to avoid unnecessary antibiotics. They're carpet bombing the microbiome in ways that people need to know. And we talked in the last podcast about the study from Mayo Clinic that showed kids who took antibiotics had higher rates of all these chronic diseases. Yeah. Find out what the compelling case is. If the doctor is adamant that it is critical that you have a bacterial infection that will respond to antibiotics, and it's important that you get ahead of it before you get behind the 8 ball with the infection, That's a compelling case, in my opinion. But when it's, they probably won't hurt you. You know what? We'll give you antibiotics just in case it's bacterial. That's when your antennas want to go up. By the way, one of the infectious diseases doctors at my hospital, Johns Hopkins, who is very good about the judicious and selective use of antibiotics. And she's done amazing work on the complications of antibiotics. 1 in 5 antibiotics administered in the hospital has an adverse effect that we may or may not even recognize in the hospital. Mm-hmm. That's not a totally safe thing, right? So she herself and her husband their child was having a procedure, and the doctor insisted on the child taking an antibiotics before surgery. Now, her being an infectious diseases specialist with a particular focus on antibiotic appropriateness at Johns Hopkins, she knew that was BS. Mm-hmm. And so she tried to question it. But she also didn't want to be seen as, already the disobedient, difficult mother.
Yeah.
And this is what's going on with the expert I respect the most in the country on antibiotics and infectious diseases. This is what the dance she's having to do with her doctor. People need to be educated. Mm-hmm. They need to know the truth on antibiotics, the appropriateness, the inappropriate use, and the gray zone. And they need to make their own decisions based on the severity of your illness. How many times do we hear about somebody, they're sick, they took antibiotics, and now I'm better? Well, you may have been better without the antibiotics.
Yep. So I think last night you also mentioned about the guy who discovered antibiotics, and he was talking about, the risks and need to be careful and not overprescribe. And it seems like that's not being done though.
It was an amazing story. The guy who made the greatest discovery in the history of medicine did so by leaving a window open in his laboratory in London. Now, it's unclear if he left it open or one of his lab staff left it open, but somebody left the window open. And he was growing these bacteria on Petri dishes. And the staphylococcal bacteria was on a Petri dish exposed when he was on vacation. And a mold blew in through the open window. And that mold was penicillin. And it landed on the Petri dish by accident and formed a circle around it where it had killed all the bacteria. 1922, the greatest discovery in the history of medicine. Before that time, we couldn't do surgery because people would die from infections. Half of people would die from infections from major abdominal surgery sometimes. Childbirth was dangerous. A child could die or become deaf from an ear infection. Mm-hmm. A child could die from scratching themselves because the scratch would get infected. So this is the greatest discovery in the history of medicine. By the 1940s, we began mass production. Factories were built to mass produce penicillin. And so in the 1940s and 50s, what we call the post-World War II era, we ushered in what we call the white coat era of medicine. Before then, doctors were respected, but not on a pedestal. Maybe like you'd respect your hairdresser.
Yeah.
So they were not disrespected, but we couldn't do a lot as doctors. We had basically a saw to do amputations. We could pull teeth. We had a lancet, so we would just cut your skin and allow you to bleed out to get the so-called bad humors out. Mm-hmm. That's our oldest medical journal is called The Lancet.
Wow. And
we had a couple terrible medications like digoxin that barely worked. So that was that was medicine. That was the history of medicine for most of mankind. But then with the introduction of penicillin in its mass production after World War II, we saw the white coat era of medicine. Doctors now had the power to control the administration of a magical pill that could cure you or make childbirth or surgery safe. We saw the growth of hospitals with now technology in the hospital dazzling the public, incubators, iron lung machines for people with polio. Doctors began to wear white coats. They got an unquestioned authority. And so you saw in childbirth, for example, the routine separation of babies at birth from their mother for 10 days. Didn't matter if there's no problem, baby's totally normal. For 10 days, the baby was separated so the doctors could, keep the captured human in the nursery to poke and prod and feed with this, formula milk that the companies insisted was the same as breast milk, even though it was laced with sugar and seed oils and all sorts. And so you saw this incredible paternalism enter the medical profession. This unquestioned authority fed it. And that really continued to the point where today we still battle paternalism in medicine. You see remnants of it. You see it in, people see it in their everyday interactions sometimes with medical recommendations. Don't ask questions. I'm the expert. For the most part, we now recognize some of the barbarism of the 1940s and 50s, well-intended as it was. So we're trying to get our footing, I think, as a medical profession. But the guy who discovered penicillin, that ushered in the white coat era of medicine, Alexander Fleming, he got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of antibiotics. And in the 1940s, after he got the Nobel Prize, he issued a stern warning that I go through in my book, Blind Spots. He said that there would be unintended consequences of the overuse of antibiotics and warned about side effects, and that we could undo all the progress that antibiotics have delivered in modern medicine if bacteria became resistant from overuse. And guess what's happening today? Exactly what he predicted. The mass overuse of antibiotics is resulting in bacterial resistance to the point where we are going backwards. We are now seeing people come into the hospital and there's no antibiotic that will work anymore because the infections they have are resistant to all known antibiotics that would otherwise work.
Wow. What happens for people like that?
So a couple of things. One, we just watch them. They have an ear infection. There's nothing we can do. We just watch and support them. Mm-hmm. In the world of GI infections, there's a famous one called C. diff, Clostridium difficile.
My grandma had that.
Yes,
multiple
common.
times. And
really?
then she passed away.
And from the C. diff?
I feel like it could have been from that. There was other things too, but she kept getting it and it wouldn't go away.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. It's common. Mm-hmm. It hastens a death. Mm-hmm. It'll sort of add stress to an otherwise frail individual. The interesting thing about C. diff infection, and over 30,000 people a year now in the United States die from C. diff infection. So the next pandemic, which is antimicrobial organisms, that is drug-resistant superbugs, if you will. It's here. It's already here. It's been here for years, and it's growing not exponentially, it's growing steadily. Mm-hmm. And it's already accounted for over 100,000 lives worldwide a year, and it's projected to hit millions in a number of by the year 2050.
What do you do for this? I mean, I'm like, I feel like I've heard this quite a bit, and my first thought is like, well, I'm not on antibiotics all the time, so am I okay? Or like, is that not how it works? Or like, what can you do if you have been on antibiotics a lot and you know this is coming?
A couple things. First of all, it's like pollution. Everyone needs to do their job and nobody feels like it's my responsibility, but we need everybody to adhere to appropriateness when it comes to taking antibiotics, because every antibiotic taken out there can induce resistance. Mm-hmm. And one of those mutations can create a resistant organism. Number two is buy antibiotic-free foods.
Mainly meats and like milks and things like that, eggs.
Yes.
What else?
So animals that are raised with antibiotics for the purpose of making them fatter, mainly. Mm-hmm. Now, if they use antibiotics selectively, I think that's good. If an animal's sick, give them an antibiotic. So I'm not that interested in the never antibiotic concept. I'm interested in the no routine use of antibiotics. Most antibiotics produced in the United States are not given to humans, they're given to animals. And some of those superbugs cross over through animal workers and the food supply into humans. So everyone can vote on this pandemic issue and do your part and avoid these routine use of antibiotics in food. Avoid inappropriate antibiotics in your own children and yourselves. And hand washing and other things, but this is a global problem, and you'd be surprised. Poorer countries in the world the United States, in the world, do a worse job with antibiotic appropriateness, because in some of these countries, African countries and Pakistan, I described in my book, and Bangladesh, antibiotics are seen as a privilege. They're seen as something the wealthy can do, and they're seen as a magical pill. And so people take antibiotics for headaches or migraines or it's just seen as, well, maybe the antibiotic will help. And, they may live in countries without good medical guidance. And so you see more overuse of antibiotics now in some of these poor countries where you don't even need a prescription. Beware of telemedicine. I mean, telemedicine has done tremendous good in bridging some of these health disparities, but are you really getting a proper evaluation of an ear infection over telemedicine when they can't even look in the ear?
Yeah.
Beware of doctors that don't know how to distinguish bacterial from serous otitis media, that is an ear infection. And when I say beware of them, beware of me, because I can't distinguish the two. I just don't do it frequently enough. It's been a long time since med school. You want a doctor who is skilled at distinguishing those two, which you can do with a good physical exam. This is why people need to get in to see their doctors and their ENTs and their primary care doctors who know how to make the distinction. So we're appropriately taking antibiotics.
Yep. Yeah. So I feel like a lot of my parenting ideas comes from like grandmothers, great grandmothers. I mean, people in my family line or other people's families. And oftentimes what they say, I feel like is now coming true. And like some of them are, if you think they have an ear infection, 9 times out of 10, you don't need antibiotics. They'll get past it. And so I've always been like, oh, okay, you'll be fine. And my kids, at least my kids, have always been fine. And when it comes to Tylenol, they're like, if they have a fever, let them ride it out. And so I let my kids have fevers all the way up to like 104. Like when they have it, I'm like, okay, you got it, bud. Let's put a cold washcloth on your head. And I feel like I'm Amish sometimes compared to friends who are like, that is terrible. They're going to have a seizure. You're going to ruin their brain. And like people think I'm a hippie for letting my kids ride it out. But now I feel like there's some research coming out about Tylenol making it worse for kids. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Well, first of all, seizures in children from fevers are not caused by the peak temperature. It's caused by the rate of increase. Mm-hmm. So once they have a high temperature, you're already past that window. Mm-hmm. And studies have shown that these fever-lowering medications like Tylenol and ibuprofen extend the illness.
Yep.
Because the high temperature is the body's natural way of trying to rid the infection. Now, you don't want kids to be uncomfortable. So if a kid is in pain or incredibly uncomfortable, then sometimes those medications, ibuprofen, Tylenol, can be compassionate.
Yeah, I'll do it at night. If I'm like, you really have not gotten sleep last night and the night before or something, then I'll be like, that's when I might fold. Be like, I think sleep might be more important than that. But yeah.
Beware of red number 40, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
And yellow number 5. That's in like asthma medication. So if it causes asthma, then it's used in the asthma medication. But anyway, a study out of Johns Hopkins found that kids with chickenpox had a longer duration of chickenpox when they were given these, what we call antipyretic or the temperature lowering medications, Tylenol, ibuprofen specifically. And there's a little concern with Tylenol in young kids. We've assumed it's totally safe, but I can tell you nothing is 100% safe in medicine, despite what people may think. That's a dogma that there's 100% safety with certain medications. There's a study out of Duke that I mentioned in the book Blind Spots where people have had concerns about Tylenol in children, even at accepted doses.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing they do if you ever take your kid into the ER, they're like, they give them a huge dose of Motrin or Tylenol. I'm like, whoa, that's like 3 times the amount that I would ever give them at home. Like, and I don't know if that's necessary to do it in that high of a dose.
I see that all the time in the hospital. I'll get a call. Hey, your patient had a fever. We already gave Tylenol. And I'm like, why? And they'll be like, well, because they had a fever. Okay, what are we treating? Well, they just have a fever. It's a reflex in the hospital. It's not rational. It's not logical. It's a reflex. We should be using these medications, Tylenol and ibuprofen, selectively and not routinely for all temperatures.
So this is a good segue into, we kind of touched on a little bit about like physicians and how do you find them? And last night you were talking about, you created, I think, a way to like profile or score physicians on a bell curve, which I thought was very fascinating. And I'm sure no one knows about this, like at least in my world. And so I would love for you to go through where this came from and why you wanted to create a profiling system for physicians.
We are giving them their data to allow them to improve. So one thing we're doing is we have a consortium of doctors that get together and talk about areas of inappropriate care that are well known in medicine, that are practice patterns by individual doctors that we can measure in big data. So we can look at big databases that we already have access to and say, This doctor has a C-section rate in low-risk deliveries way above an accepted rate. A C-section rate of 80% in low-risk deliveries. Now, using a bunch of mathematical algorithms, we can figure out, okay, they've delivered 22 babies, and their rate is 67% in low-risk deliveries. That's too high for 22 cases. That's not random chance. That's a pattern, and that's a bad pattern, and that's a pattern that the doctor needs help, that maybe they shouldn't get the referrals. Maybe the primary care doctors in the community need to know about that. And so we have hundreds of these algorithms now where we profile, measure doctors by their practice patterns. And what we find overall, the conclusion from all of our analyses, is that most doctors do the right thing and always try to. But there's a subgroup, depending on the specialty and depending on the procedure or the type of care, could be ordering unnecessary tests in primary care, could be putting in hardware during spine surgery, that is fusing the joints too frequently. We know from the experts in each field what those patterns are. And what we see is 3 to 25% of doctors with any given measure are in that outlier inappropriate care pattern zone. And so we work now with hospitals, primary care offices, health plans, employer groups that want access to some of these data for their health plan, patient navigation groups, narrow network plans. So anyone in the business world of medicine who's interested in these types of insights, where you can actually go into your local town and look at the surgeons or the OBs or the primary care doctors in your region and see how they perform. Those are insights now that we're making available to large organizations. What
about us? How do I get access to this? I want to know how to find a good doctor and know they're in the bell curve.
So this endeavor, which is, we call it GAM, or it's at gameasures.com, has not been available as a consumer-facing product. And I think it's because Dr. Brune and the physician consortium that runs this believes that we need to clean up our own house and not ignite a public to then, start World War III in the community with the local doctors. We're a little protective of the data. We want to share insights with people who can really make a difference at an organizational level. And so if you have an organization, this set of insights is available at gameasures.com. Dr. Brune runs it, and it's been very successful. Lots of good is coming out of it. And we've shown if you show doctors where they stand on the bell curve, they auto-correct after they see their performance.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear at least. I'd want to know about the doctors that don't. And they're like, I'm stuck in my ways.
It's very concerning.
Yeah.
It's very concerning. And historically, when you measure doctors, they may not be conforming because their patients are sicker or they are super subspecialized or on the cutting edge of doing something new. So we need to protect innovators. But what we see with our physician expert sort of consensus is doctors practicing with a pattern they cannot defend to a group of peers. They are well-known ways of gaming the system, and there's no justification for being an outlier, or at least it's highly unlikely there's a justification. But this is where, we believe doctors need to fix the bad practice patterns of doctors. And so this is really a grassroots physician effort to clean up our own house and to make healthcare better and safer.
Yeah, I love it. So your book, it's been on the New York Times bestseller for 5 straight weeks.
Yeah, really excited about it. Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations. So I want to know, I think you mentioned this at one point, that a lot of the things that you've studied and looked into, you were actually told not to by a lot of people because you couldn't get funding, because they thought it was pointless, because whatever. Tell me about this, this battle that you have with the things that you want to work on and the consensus of people telling you no.
Well, first of all, I don't think the people who told me don't waste your time on this were evil. I think they just are part of a medical culture where they reward obedience, and you are supposed to do certain things like get a grant from the National Institutes of Health or get a grant from Pharma and do a research study, write up an article or present a poster at a medical conference, and then explain your ideas. And to me, it just all seems like very low yield. What are we doing? I mean, we're watching all these chronic diseases go up. No one's talking about root causes. We're talking about these small incremental research studies, which, look, I believe in research. I've published over 300 peer review articles in the medical literature. I've done a ton of research. I do a ton of research. I believe in research, and I believe in good research methodology. But sometimes we develop giant blind spots in medicine. And my interest has always been at Johns Hopkins in my career on studying the big topics we're not talking about that we need to talk about. Gut health, the microbiome, overprescribing, medical errors, predatory billing by hospitals, and price gouging of patients, ruining their life financially, unethical behaviors, practice patterns that are out of line. None of these things fit in a traditional model. So I began in the world of patient safety, writing about medical errors, and there's not a lot of research money allocated to medical errors. So my colleagues at Johns Hopkins, who were by and large supportive, but they would nudge me and say, you're not going to get promoted like this. You're not going to get any good papers. You're not going to get funding from the National Institutes of Health. And that is the ultimate currency of our academic university ivory tower of the medical field. Well, I did not get a grant from the NIH to study patient safety, but I pushed ahead anyway, thanks to the mentorship of a guy named Dr. Peter Pronovost. And we developed something called the surgery checklist. We published it with no external funding. And then the World Health Organization called and said, this makes sense. Pilots use a checklist before surgery, before flights. Surgeons should use a checklist before surgery. And it gets the team on the same page. It reduces communication breakdowns. It helps us anticipate needs during the operation ahead of time. It improves the culture of speaking up. And so the WHO took an interest, basically took this checklist and put their seal on it. And that checklist is in the operating room of most operating rooms in the world. And so I did not listen to those voices. Same thing with frailty. We believed the frailty syndrome is what makes people vulnerable to some medical interventions. We haven't been measuring it. We kind of have an eyeball test. We walk in and see a patient. They look frail. But really, what are we basing it on? Their eyebrow hairs or their
skinny,
skinny, their wrinkles. I mean, what are we using? We're using this very crude, but you could kind of tell who doesn't walk steady, but it turns out people are not just frail in their musculoskeletal system. They could be frail cognitively. That is, a little stress can tip them off into delirium in the hospital or cognitive decline. Their heart could be frail. A little surgical stress can put them into heart failure. Their kidneys may be frail. So a little bit of stress can put them into renal failure. And so we described the frailty syndrome. Linda Fried, who's now the dean at Columbia School of Public Health, and a bunch of us at Johns Hopkins described this frailty syndrome. I led a clinical trial to show that it was the best predictor of surgical outcome of anything we use. Heart testing and other stuff was the best predictor. And so again, I was told, this is not very fundable. This is not really a true academic science. But frailty became recognized, and we ended up getting a grant to study it. So anyway, for all those scientists out there who are hearing those same voices, focus on what's going to get you funded and promoted. I say, no, focus on what's going to have an impact on society.
Yes, mic drop.
Which is what you're about.
Yeah, that's what I'm about. Yes, you're right. Focus on what's going to have an impact, change lives, mission. Throughout this, we've heard a lot of, hard things to hear, but also hopefully people are feeling inspired to take action and think differently and look at ingredient labels and think about, how they're entering into the healthcare system. But what are some solutions like that you're seeing? What are some upsides of like what people can do, or just the upside to all this?
Yeah, there's a movement right now, and it's amazing. I'm optimistic about the future. We're seeing incredible consumer demand, just like we saw with getting rid of added sugar. What did the food industry do? They started to say, no added sugar in this product. They started marketing to that demand. So we need education to people to know what's the truth is. It's why I wrote the book Blind Spots. It's why you've got your podcast. There's other doctors out there writing books, going directly to the public to educate them. Casey Means, Mark Hyman, Peter Attia, so many other smart, respected doctors, and I'm not including all of them, but there is a newsletter called Casey's Kitchen, Dr. Casey Means. I'm a big fan of it. You're seeing a movement now with political authority to usher in a new era of addressing our poison food supply. But a lot of it is local. People need to get active in their school district, talk about the school lunch programs, figure out how we can fund school lunch programs to buy healthier foods. And if you think paying a couple dollars more per meal is prohibitively expensive, try insulin, try metformin and IV drug infusions later in life, try knee replacement or cardiac cabbage surgery or a stent. I mean, we have been so myopic that we have been a penny wise, pound foolish with school lunch programs. We need some leadership. We need national leadership, but we need mothers and parents to go to their school district and request organic fruits and vegetables, request non-ultra processed foods, things that are local foods. Get rid of some of these highly addictive foods that pack in sugar. And high fructose corn syrup is a good tool that the food industry uses to pack in more sugar. It's not more dangerous types of sugar. It's just packed in a lot more to increase that sweetness to make it more addictive. We're the only species with obesity rates like we see. You just don't see it in other species. And why is that? Because of the way we pack in these highly addictive foods like sugar. Avoid seed oils, things you talk about. Let's not demonize natural fat. Eating low fat is not really going healthy. It is ignoring the role of ultra-processed foods, pesticides. Filter your water. Filter the water in schools when people are drinking water. Avoid plastic bottles. Have good glass and metal
You're
like
welcome.
you've got here in your studio. So there's a lot people can do. And ultimately, I'm very optimistic about what's happening right now. Young people get it. A lot of doctors on the treadmill don't like being on the treadmill. You know, we as a medical profession have the highest rate of burnout of almost any profession. We have the highest rate of suicide of any profession. People want to get off the treadmill and start talking about health, not just sickness, how to stay healthy and to get at the root causes, the big topics that we were never taught in medical school that are emerging as the clear and obvious root causes of our chronic disease epidemic. So there's an exciting movement right now. And so I think everybody can take a part and everybody can be involved and actually make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very excited. I mean, you already said this, but the world of media right now, I mean, even thinking about social media, which of course there's downsides to it, and how quickly information can get around and how quickly you can train the algorithm to see these things. I mean, I know when I get on Instagram, when I'm on TikTok, the things that it's showing me is like, these kind of oils are good. Here's what not to cook with. Oh, you think your stuff is grass-fed. Here's a video of a cow being held in a cage having grass-fed to it. Like, now you need to look for pasture raised, and like how quickly information can get out there, and you can see it if you just look for a couple of these things in your, social media, and then all of a sudden you'll see all of it, and it'll be so common knowledge because this content is everywhere. Like, you just have to train your feed to find it. So good. Well, thank you for coming on the show a second time. This was amazing. Where can people find more about you and your book?
Great. The book is available wherever books are sold. I'm on social media. I don't even know which platforms anymore, but most of them. So thanks so much for your time. It's great getting to know you and your team. So thanks for having me.